This is stage 6, 17.8 miles, Frog's Leap. Hey.
Okay. There you go.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thanks. Thanks for working, guys. We appreciate it.
Okay, well, we're looking at
Long Small Crest 100, left 5 plus, kinks 120.
oh, and then what?
Small Crest, left 6,
Okay,
Small Crest 70.
that's pretty fast.
Yeah. We are armed and dangerous. 10. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Long Small Crest 100. Left 5 plus. Kinks 120. Small Crest into a left 6. Into a Small Crest 70. Right 5 minus. Left 6 plus 200. Right 6 plus, left 6, into a right 4 plus, no cut, opens. Repeat, right 4 plus, no cut, opens. Into a left 5 plus. Nice. Left 5 plus into Small Crest, into a right 6, into a left 4 plus. Right 6 over Small Crest, long, 70. Right 5 minus, 70. Left 5 opens over crest, 50. Right 6 into left 6 long, 50. Turn right 4 minus, repeat left 6 long, 50. Turn right 4 minus, 50. Left 5 over jump. Into a right 6 plus over Small Crest.
Next.
Into right 5 loose, left 5 long, into right 6, into left 5 minus 200, right 6 plus short over Small Crest, into a left 6 plus short, sorry, not short, left 6 plus over crest 50, turn right 5 minus, 50, Small Crest into a right 5 plus long, crest mid down into a left 5, into right 6, into a caution left 5 over jump, into a right 4, 50, and a left 5 minus over big crest, 70, chicane right entry. Chicane right entry. Left 4 over big crest, into right 5 minus, no cut, opens tightens 5 plus. Repeat, right 5 minus, no cut, open tightens 5 plus. 100.
Next.
Stay left over crest, 50. Chicane right entry. Turn right 3 minus 600. Right 3 minus 600. Left 5 plus 70, flat crest 150, go, go, go. Okay. Very long crest 100, right 6 long, slowing over Small Crest. Okay, this is very long crest 100, right 6 long, slowing over Small Crest into chicane right entry. Chicane right entry. Right 5, left 5, into Small Crest 70, right 5 plus 70.
Next.
Small Crest into right 6 plus,
Next.
200.
Yep.
Small Crest 50, left 5 minus, into a flat crest 300. Left 5 minus, flat crest 300. Small crest 70, right 6 plus 50, chicane right entry. Right 5 minus into turn right 3 minus tidy. Repeat, right 5 minus into turn right 3 minus tidy. Into left 4 plus 120. Left 6 plus 200.
Next.
Long small crest into a left 4 minus very long. Into right 5 plus 50. Stay left over small crest 120, small crest into a left 4 minus no cut. Into right 4 minus, repeat, left 4 minus no cut, into right 4 minus. Into left 5 plus. Into turn right 2 plus no cut, right 2 plus no cut, 250. This is the one with the bump. Small crest 70, left 5 over small crest long 180. Then caution turn right 2 plus. This is left 5. Yep, there's your 180. Caution turn left 2 plus tidy 200. Small crest. Into right 5, into crest, into left 6, very long, 350. Right 6 plus 250. And then a caution right 5 plus, chicane right entry. Go, go, go. There's your right 5 plus. Chicane right entry. 100. Turn left 4, no cut. Into flat small crest 250. Right 5 minus, double caution 50, left 4 into turn right 2 over crest. Repeat, left 4 into right 2 over crest. This is double caution for the 2. 50, and a right 6 plus, stay out, chicane left entry, repeat, chicane left entry, 150. Right 6 plus, into a left 5 over small crest, 250. Right 6 plus, 50.
Next.
Right 6, very long, 70. Left 6, tightens. Oh, this is very, very long, actually. 70, and left 6, tightens. Right 5 minus, 200. Right 6, 250.
Second.
Right 6, 250. Left 6 plus over small crest into a right 5. Into crest 70 and a left 5 extra long over small crest 50. There's your left 5 extra long over small crest 50. Rough into right 4 plus. Into stay left over small crest 120. Left 6 plus into caution right 4, tightens 3. Repeat, caution right 4, tightens 3 into small crest into a left 5, 70. Right 5 plus over small crest into a left 4, very long. Right 5 over small crest 70.
Next.
Left 5 minus over long crest 50. Small crest 50. Right 3 long go 400. Repeat, 50. Right 3 long go 400. Stay left over long crest into jump 70. Stay left over small crest 50. Left 6 plus into right 6. Left 6 opens tightens over long small crest into chicane right entry. There's your left 6 opens or tightens and opens over long small crest into chicane right entry. 120. Left 3 minus, no cut. Right 4 minus, 50. Left 6 extra long, into small crest, into left 5 minus long, opens over small crest, 50. Right 4 no cut, 100. There's your right 4 no cut, 100. Small crest, 150. Repeat, small crest 150, turn right 3 plus. Left 6 plus long over small crest 150. Flat small crest 150. Right 6 plus into a left or right 5 minus, repeat, right 6 plus into right 5 minus 70. And a left 6 over jump 100. Repeat, left 6 over jump 100. Chicane right entry. Jump 450. Nice. Left 5 plus opens very long into very long crest. 250. Then caution big jump down 200. There it is. That's your caution big jump down 200. Not that slow. Right 6 plus no cut into slow over small jump into left 6 over double small jump 250. Nice. Small crest into a left 6 plus and a right 6 plus over small crest 350. Right 6 over crest 70.
Next.
Right 5 minus over crest down 200. Right 6 over small jump 120. Small crest 70. Small right 6 over small jump 450. Go, go, go. Go, go, go. Chicane right entry. You could go more.
I don't want to cook my brakes too much. I can feel them fading there.
Left 4 over crest long 70. Jump down 150. Turn right 1 around barrels. Right 6, 120. Left 6, 50. Right 6, 300. So just keep it in. Left 6 plus, 50. Left 5 plus, into right 6, 250. Repeat, left 6 plus, 50. Left 5 plus, into right 6, 250. Right 6 into flat small crest, 200. This is right 6 flat small crest, 200. Small crest into right 5 plus, rough starts, repeat, rough starts, 100. Small crest, 50. Right 5 plus over crest tidy, 150. Stay left over small crest.
Next.
Into right 6 plus, into left 4 minus rough 120. turn, right 4 minus, very long, rough ends. For a 50 over double small crest. Nice.
450.
Left 450 over double small crest, left 5, 100. Mid small crest, 50. Caution, left 5 over jump, opens 250. Repeat, caution, left 5 over jump, opens 250. Right 6 plus, left 6 plus, 180. Left 5 minus, no cut, 300. Oh, there's your
Got
left
it.
5 minus, no cut. Yep. 300. Mid small crest, 120, chicane right entry. It's in the ditch there. Small jump, 150. Nice. Flat small crest, 100. Long flat crest, 300. Right 6 plus, over small crest, 50. Flat small crest, 250. Left 5 plus, very long, go 200. Flat small crest, 200. Stay right over small crest, 70.
Next.
Small crest into left 6 over crest, 100. And a caution crest into right 6 plus short into jump down left 6. Repeat, right caution crest into right 6 plus short into jump down left 6.
Got it.
Right 5 minus, 180. Left 5 plus over small crest into right 5 plus over finish, 100. And a left 6. Okay, you're done. Slow it, slow it, slow it. Hey!
Guys,
Oh, watch out.
Woo! Here you go.
Thank you.
Have fun.
Thanks.
Did you fast?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Felt it.
Thanks, man. Go ahead. That was insane.
Crap.
Yeah, good job on that.
Thanks.